Well, hello there. I'm Park Howell, and I welcome you to the business of story. You know, we're celebrating our 5th anniversary this month, and we'd like to thank you for helping make the business of story among the top 10% of downloaded podcasts in the world, according to Libsyn. If you like our show, you're going to love our new book, Brand Bewitchery, which teaches you how to wield the story cycle system to craft spellbinding stories for your brand. You can order your print or Kindle copy now on Amazon. Okay, if you're interested in becoming a sought-after podcast guest to grow your business, then today's show is for you.
So I think it's very important for podcast hosts and guests to think of, I'm going to be judged not only by today's standards, but by future standards. And so you want to always be at that leading edge, not at the laggard edge, because you don't want to be the butt of somebody's joke or an example of how not to do it.
Gosh, after a frustrating year of being hounded by show bookers and PR firms that don't do their homework, pitching people who aren't right for our show, to dealing with guests who show up unprepared for interviews and stumbling their way through them with word crutches like ums and uhs and likes and rights, to sucky audio quality because they were using earbuds, Bluetooth to their iPhone with spastic Wi-Fi in an office that must be totally void of any furniture or pictures because it sounds like an echo chamber. I finally broke. I couldn't take it anymore. So I called the one person I know who could fix it, or at least provide some solace to this sulking host, Tom Schwab of Interview Valet. To me, Interview Valet is the most reputable podcast booking service we work with. Tom and his team only call on us when they have a prospect that is truly right for our show, and then Interview Valet coaches them up so their appearances become an asset for you, my listeners. They're an asset for me as a host because it allows me to create as high a quality show as possible. And then finally, they become an asset for their business because of the trust that they can build through the great stories they share. Edison Research says 65% of listeners report being likely to purchase after hearing about a product or service on a podcast. Tom's own studies show podcasting interviews can convert 25 times better than blogs. But here's the kicker. Your appearance on a popular podcast is not about you. It's about the listener, and you want to put your best voice forward. So Tom and I chatted, he listened to my concerns, and he gave me some really great advice. So much so that I said, this would make a great show. Today, from my standpoint as a host, producer, and from Tom's view of booking talent and getting them prepared for shows, we're going to share with you 6 things you can do to become a sought-after podcast guest. We'll show you how to grow your brand and business by being in service to the show and its listeners. Are you ready? Please welcome Tom Schwab of Interview Valet to the business of story.
Park, I am thrilled to be here. I appreciate all you do and share your frustration and also your clarity in actually helping people. One of the secrets in podcasting is that often when interviews go bad, the file gets lost. And I'm sorry, there was problems. We can't put that up there. And there's a lot of people that have had interviews that never were heard because of that. And you were nice enough to tell your guests, and now nice enough to tell the world also. And with that, I've got to say that I'm nervous here because I often say, all those crutch words. And I realize what a chore that is for the podcast host because the bar has gotten raised so much on the quality that the shows that don't take those out are noticeable. So to be a good guest, you want to come prepared. And I'm looking forward to having a discussion here on what you see as a host. You've had, 5 years. Congratulations on that. I've been on over 1,200 podcasts. I still haven't launched my own show because anybody that tells you doing a podcast is easy has either never done it or never done it well. Park, you just make it look easy.
Well, thank you for that. And we started Jay Barrett Convince and Convert was hugely helpful in launching my show 5 years ago. And that time, I think there was about 250,000 podcasts out there. And then Tom, you just informed me in your email that now we're up to like 1.1 million shows, but only really about a third of those are being heard. Others are stop. They may only have 10 episodes and that's about it. But back then, and Jay kind of gave me this coaching, and I know it's changed since. It's like, oh, it really, the quality doesn't matter that much. It's the content. Just crank it out, get it out there, and get the content going. But we all know that that has remarkably changed. Thank you, NPR, and shows like How I Built This and the production quality. And a show to survive has to have production quality to it, and that starts with the guest.
And we see this in other mediums too. You think back and look at some of the television from like the 50s and 60s. We watch it now and you just scratch your head thinking, did people actually watch this junk? Well, that was the standard at that time, and people met that standard. And when you started out 5 years ago, the standard was so much lower, right? When podcasts first started, all you need was a built-in microphone in your computer, hit record on GarageBand, and you had a podcast there. Well, you also got as much respect as Wayne's World. Podcasters were thought of as two dudes in their mom's basement. That was a long time ago. I mean, we've known each other for a long time, but even early on, you were at the high level of what podcasting was going to be and continue to be that way. So I think it's very important for podcast hosts and guests to think of, I'm going to be judged not only by today's standards, but by future standards. And so you want to always be at that leading edge, not at the laggard edge, because you don't want to be the butt of somebody's joke or an example of how not to do it.
And these episodes are evergreen. They are around forever. So I even cringe at some of my early shows and like that. Well, I'm learning as I go. And I had another company producing my shows up until COVID. And what I would do is get the guests, I would record them, send them all the files, and they did an admirable job of producing them. But I remember about a year ago, I was driving up to northern Arizona with my wife, Michelle, listening to one of my recent episodes, and I had yet another very brilliant story artist out of New York who did a lot of work in theater and movie making, and she had unbelievable insight. But the problem was, Tom, as we were going, she must have used the word right, I don't know, 100 times in that episode. It became such a tick that my wife was like, we got to turn this off, and it wasn't taken out. Obviously, I didn't know that it wasn't taken out. And I realized then that maybe I need to take over production of my show, which I've done in COVID because I've had time to do it. But the biggest problem is I don't have time to go in and spend 2 to 3 hours to clean up interviews when that guest could just simply be more prepared and more articulate and really having that self-awareness of how they sound and how they talk. So on today's show, we're going to talk about how, I hope anyways, people show up to my show and get insights from a guy that books people all around the world on shows. How do you move from being a podcast guest into a podcast asset for the listener, for the host, and then for yourself in that order? Where would you like to begin?
Why don't we start out on the beginning of starting even in the preparation? Because I think what you talk about there is showing up prepared and comfortable. And one of the things that always amazes me, I think of back when we first met, was at Social Media Marketing World. We met and we walked over from the conference, down in San Diego there. You could tell the people that just showed up there and those people that prepared. And often you could tell whether or not they were presenters, and you judged them on how they looked. And now no one would show up at Michael Stelzner's stage to talk in front of 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 people without being prepared. But yet I'm amazed at how many people will show up to a podcast interview and just wing it. And that's disrespectful to the host. It's disrespectful to the listeners, and it doesn't help them out. The other thing too is I believe they get nervous. When people start to get nervous, they may know their content, but then they're going to start using those crutch words, and all their credibility goes out. Are they prepared? Did they show up with a microphone that makes them sound great? There's a lot that an audio editor can do to help you, but if you're coming off on your internal microphone, there's not much that they can do. If you come off sounding like you just called in from prison or a bathroom, your expertise goes out the wall or out the door. It's almost like if you show up at a live event looking like you just rolled out of bed in your pajamas, the content doesn't matter. Everybody's going to make judgment on the way it was prepared. So I think a lot of it is taking podcasts seriously now. You're not talking to two guys in their mom's basement. This is not Wayne's World anymore. That was maybe 2012 or 2020. And somebody is listening to this in 2025. And I hope they think, wow, their quality is really good even for this day and age. So I think the big thing is coming prepared.
Yeah. Who a host that does a really good job with this is Douglas Burdett at the Marketing Book podcast. Really an amazing show. He's invited me on the show now that I've got my new book, Brand Bewitchery, out. Little plug there. But he did something I've not seen any other host, including myself, do. He has a little video that you have to watch. And he says, here's how I expect you to show up and be prepared. And even the audio quality, recommending a microphone, the Logitech, the Logitech 390 headset for $25. So that passes the Douglas Burdett level of production quality. Everybody can afford that. And I was really impressed with that. Now, I had a person, so real quick, I select my guests three ways. First and foremost, it's people I seek out, people whose work I admire, I see what they're doing, and I know that they are going to bring value to my audience. Number two, then, I rely on trusted advisors like you. You brought me that long walk on social media marketing world in 2016. You introduced me to Christopher Lochhead, and he was a marvelous guest. Brilliant, really knew his stuff, and we had a lot of fun on that show. So number two is on reliable referrals, which are few and far between because people in your industry do not do their homework and they throw out blanket invites, and it drives me freaking crazy because we don't have time to go through that. They haven't done their homework to figure out if their client is right for your show. And then the third one is a paid appearance. If someone really wants to be on my show, we charge them $500. Now, this is a person that I've not seeked out or sought after. This is someone who has not come in as a referral, that they're just going to bring great quality. It's that third one that, I might have happened upon someone. I do my research. I find that they could really provide value, but I charge $500 for the appearance because it makes them get really super focused and professional about showing up. The one other point I will say with that, I sometimes get pushback, people saying $500. I've never had to, pay to be on a show. People pay me to be on a show. Well, I also want our listeners to know that a lot of time, energy, and money goes into producing these shows and bringing as much valuable content as possible. And guests, I hope, would appreciate that it's not just a freebie. We're not just doing this out of mom's basement, that this is a professional program and we want people showed up to be prepared. And so that's the first question I have then for you. When you are pitching a guest, what advice can you provide to wannabe guests and what they can do to get prepared to pitch a show that's actually appropriate and not just putting a blanket pitch out there? What do you do to get them ready?
Can I start with pushing back on a word? I detest, no, that's a strong word, loathe or hate maybe, the word pitch, right? Because to me, pitch is dehumanizing. You pitch a baseball, you introduce a person. And these people that are pitching aren't helping the community, right? So from that standpoint, you get a lot of pitches. I get pitches to be on my podcast, and I don't have a podcast. They have not done their homework. It's insulting, right? So this idea of pitching, I think we should make it a 4-letter word. I think we back into that, though, of what do you do to introduce yourself to the host in hopes of them, him or her, introducing you to the audience? Because that's ultimately what you want there. Gary Vaynerchuk talks about jab, 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 right hook. I think it's serve, 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 ask. Add value. That's what you're coming to the podcast to do. Your number one goal coming to a podcast should be to make the host look like a genius in front of his or her audience, right? That's why you're there. So show up to serve. Listen to the podcast first. Make sure it's a good fit for you, not just the audience, but also the tone of it, the subject matter. Is it explicit or is it clean? Is it is it your type of people? More podcasts are not better. Bigger is not better. Better is better. So find that podcast that you could add value to. Then do something of service. You said an author, a rating and review is one of the best gifts that you can give an author, because that's not something they can do themselves. Well, how many people have never listened to the podcast, have never left a rating and review for the podcast? We're all vain. We listen for our own names. If you leave a rating and review for a podcast, they will read it. They will see it. The same thing if you go on their LinkedIn, their social media, mention something nice about the podcast, leave a comment on the social media, retweet it, repost it, engage with them. You talked about the 3 types of people that you wanted to have on your show, and I thought that was an interesting take on it. I've always thought of it as hosts want 3 types of people: their friends, friends of friends, and people they want to be their friends. Nowhere in there does it say cold pitch. So do something to get on their radar, to serve them. Then once you've done that, you've sort of earned the right to reach out to them. And you should not go as a pitch.
One thing I admire about you guys is you always send me appropriate guests. And here's the big thing. You haven't reached out in probably the last 3 or 4 months. I haven't seen anything from Interview Valet, and that's not a knock. That's actually a kudos, because that just tells me you don't have a guest that's appropriate for Business Story at the moment. But every time you guys have sent me one, you've done your homework and said, here, Park, here's why I think Christopher Lockhead, good example, would be a good guest on your show. And he was stellar.
Once again, bigger is not better. More is not better. Better is better. Nobody wants another pitch. Everybody wants another great guest. So we actually track with all of our team members what their yes percentage is. I don't care how many pitches you sent out, right? And I get the robo pitches all the time. How many introductions did you make? And what percentage of them were yes? Because if they said no, that's fine, but find out why they weren't a good fit, because you don't want to waste your time or the host time. So really focus from that. The next thing is to make it easy for the host to say yes. Most of us compose emails on desktop and then we read them on the phone. If it's a 10-page press kit that you put in the email, if it's a long email, that's just a reason for me to say no. Boil it down. Get to the point. Don't sound like every other canned pitch out there. Show that you've actually engaged with the show, that you have something to add to the show, and then put everything else as an attachment. You've seen all of our clients would come with, we call them one sheets, right? A 1-page media kit. Here's the picture. Here's the social media. Here's some topics. If there's a book, there's a book summary. Here's how to introduce them in the third person, rip and read. It just makes it easier for them. Another thing that you can do that's very powerful is when you send a picture of yourself, you'll notice that mine has my microphone in front of it. There's no question that I've done this before, that I'll have the right equipment, and that I'm taking this seriously. And so all of those little things, they sound like little things, but they can make you stand out because in some ways I think of it as like monster.com, right? You can sign up for monster.com and get access to 7 billion resumes. There's more resumes there than there are people in the world, but it doesn't make it easier. It's not like you're going out there and saying, oh, I'm going to search through all 7 billion. No, you want to have somebody introduce you or make it easy to stand out. And I think if we focus on that relationship as opposed to how many transactions we can make, it'll be better for the host, it'll be better for the guest, and ultimately better for the listeners too.
Now, on my frustrated call to you yesterday and saying, Tom, are you seeing the same thing with your guests? I asked you, how do you coach your clients to sound articulate? Because when they are using these right, and whatever, those are conversation crutches that makes that interview limp along, versus taking your audience on a journey that they can be transformed in a little bit, in a little way, with your business sense and what you have to share. And you had an interesting response to me on that, kind of surprised. Would you share what your answer was?
It's a very hard thing to teach people if they don't want to learn. So we actually listen for it in our sales process. And we don't sell, we help people solve their problems. But when we're talking with them, if they're not conversational, if they can't carry on a conversation with one of our team to talk about podcast interview marketing, how are they going to carry on a conversation with a podcast host? So examples, if they get argumentative, if they keep cutting you off, if they won't let you get in a word in edgewise, things like that. It's like, no judgment, right? That's your style. That's who you are. God bless you. But it's probably not going to be the best podcast interview. To me, I always think of podcast interviews as sitting down at a Denny's, right? There's 2 interesting people sitting behind me having a great conversation. Now, it'd be rude for me to turn on and watch them, and it'd be rude for me to get in there. But I think there's some kind of voyeuristic aspect that we have that we just want to listen in and learn. Now, when they're 2 friends that are comfortable, it's a great conversation. But you can tell if it's one person that's having the conversation or if it's a job interview and somebody's nervous. You can pick that out really quick. And so we listen for that as we're talking. Do we want to work with them, helping them get on great podcasts?
And then you just simply, if they are not conversational, you do not bring them into your fold and push them out there for fear that you're going to get this clunky guest that the host is just going to get completely frustrated with.
Yes. And really, because we're putting our reputation on the line, we're putting their reputation on the line, we're putting the relationships, right? So if we introduce a clunky guest to you, that's going to hurt our relationship. And if you put them on the air, that's going to hurt your relationship with them, with your audience. So often we will tell them that you need to work on this. Some people are open to it. Other people aren't. Other people will say, you don't understand. I've talked all this. I've done these different things. Okay, that's fine. But I don't think you would be a fit for us in our process. Where we see it happen more than anything, though, is when people get nervous. And you can see this even with politicians. They can be the smoothest politician going, but when they get a question out of left field that throws them back on their heels, you'll see them start stuttering or stammering, going to other things. And so I think that's often the biggest problem. I'm sure if you were in their element, if you were in their class, they would be amazing. They would be brilliant because they're comfortable there. I think often we just assume that if you're comfortable in front of a chalkboard or in front of a class, that you'll be comfortable in front of a podcast microphone. To me, I've gotten comfortable with it. I still am uncomfortable in either radio or TV, because with radio, you're always up against the clock. And to me, that's stressful. Or television, where I'm talking to you, but then there's this camera, and am I supposed to look at that? Where am I supposed to look? The lights. So I think a lot of it is getting them comfortable with it. And so with that too, when we have new clients that come in, we always do a practice interview. And practice interview is with me so that we can give them the feedback with love, give them the best practices and suggestions. And we talked about this. There was a client that we worked with, great guy. He is the cybersecurity analyst on Fox News. Awesome. He is brilliant. He can tell everything you need to know in 2 to 3 minutes. He can speak in sound bites. That's what he's trained to do. But we'd get him on a podcast, and it was painful because he'd give an answer that was right to the point, 30 seconds, no story, no background, and he was ready for the next question. And it's like, Morgan, we got to stretch these out a little bit. This is a 40-minute interview. The host is going to run out of questions at minute 5. So just being comfortable with that different medium there. And I think that's really where we help our clients, is to get them comfortable with the medium and help them prepare. Only kids and clowns like surprises. We don't take our guests for either one. So before every podcast, we brief them on what's the show about, who's Park, what's his story, what's his background, what kinds of things do they talk about, what are things to stay away from, and just they can go through it in 5 to 10 minutes. We always encourage them to listen to the episode beforehand, but they can get those big points.
I want to underscore this. Please do your homework. If you have a booking agent, a PR firm, or someone within your organization representing you to try to get you on a show, then by all means, have them listen to the show. Have them understand who the host is and what they're looking for, what kind of value they want to bring to their listeners. Preparation and homework is so crucial at this point. I couldn't agree with that point more. We'll be right back with Tom Schwab to help you become that sought-after podcast guest who earns the trust of and authority with listeners by placing them first. But you won't connect with them with your opinions, assertions, stats, and facts unless you create context for your big ideas through the true stories about the real world impact you make in people's lives, and then sharing those stories in real time on the shows. Now, if you struggle with animating your big ideas through your stories, then get my book, Brand Bewitchery. You will learn 3 proven narrative frameworks that will help you captivate listeners and convert them into believers about your product or service. But you don't have to take my word for it. Here's what business presentation expert and coach Ted Frank wrote on Amazon about Brand Bewitchery, and I quote, "I work in story and therefore read a lot of books on story, and Brand Bewitchery has helped me more than any other. His explanations are clear and perfectly ride the line between being witty and conversational and cutting to the chase. But the exercises are the key. If you do them thoughtfully, you will come up with new ideas about your brand and have a way to say them quickly and powerfully." Thanks so much, Park. Well, thank you, Ted, for that great review. If this sounds like something that can help you in becoming that sought-after podcast guest, then order your copy of Brand Bewitchery today. Use these storytelling techniques to become that captivating podcast guest that shows will seek out. Because stories deliver the truth that creates the trust. Let's now talk about technology and how you can sound the best with affordable but quality equipment. Let's pick up our conversation with Tom Schwab of Interview Valet. I had a guest on a couple weeks ago who paid the $500 to be on the show, and she was promoting a virtual event that was happening in a couple weeks after that. And she phoned it in from her laptop, and the audio quality was, pretty horrendous. And I thought to myself, you are investing in this marketing. You should. And I asked her, do you have a remote microphone that you can plug in so we can get more quality? No, this is always what I do. And it was echoey and it was awful. And I had to run with it. And I felt bad even in running it because there was no time to redo it. but I wanted her to put her best foot forward. And I don't feel like that happened in that interview. Once again, Tom, because they didn't show up prepared. They were winging it a bit. And they just think, well, it's just another show. It's not that big of a deal. But I can tell you, it is a huge deal to us hosts to try to bring as high a quality of content and production value as amateurs, quite honestly. We're not surrounded by NPR staff, as you can see here. But I have invested the thousands of dollars it takes to get quality audio, and I want my guests to show up the same way. How do you get your people to show up with quality tech so they sound good?
That's easy. We give it to them. So when you're a client of ours, unless you can show me a professional microphone that's as good or better than the ones we give all our clients, I'm going to ship you that microphone.
Which one do you use?
It's the ATR 2005 USB microphone. So what we have found is that the old ATR 2100s, which if you see a silver microphone, it's typically consumer grade. If you see one that's black, it tends to be more professional grade, and the quality is just better on it. When we were using the ATR 2100s, which aren't even made anymore, the switches would break on it. And so, most people wouldn't notice that, but, we're sending out hundreds of these. And what we would see is that they would break. The professional ones we've never had problems with. And it's nice because it's a plug and play. So you don't need a mixing board. You can just put it in your computer and being a
USB plug-in?
Just a USB plug-in.
Yeah.
And with it being a dynamic microphone, it doesn't tend to pick up background noises. So some of the biggest podcast interviews I've ever done have been from hotel rooms. So if somebody's walking down the hall, you can't pick it up. Whereas if it was a condenser mic, and I know it's getting a little bit geeky, it picks up everything. So we intentionally do that.
What's the ATR 2005 cost?
We buy them in bulk, but it's right around $80 or so.
Oh, so it's very affordable, but very high quality.
Very high quality. The other thing I like about it is it comes in a little black container. It looks like an old pencil case we used to use. And so for me, I pretty much, back in the good old days when I was traveling a lot, I would always throw that in there with my laptop so that I could do a quality interview or even a quality call wherever I was.
Yeah. So now let's talk about guest preparation and having them have their wits about them, because I'm looking for wit and wisdom, fun, action, and I've got some guidance that I would like to share. So if any of you want to be a guest on my show or anybody's show, here's a couple things that I want you to think about. And then Tom, jump in anytime you like as we go through this, okay? So the first and foremost thing is, as we've been talking about here, is do your homework and ask the same question I asked that's been very helpful to me when I've been hired to come in and do a masterclass or now a Zoom session, workshop, or whatever. The very first question out of my mouth is, what is a win for you, producer? Who's hiring me? And so in this case, it would be the host. What is the win for you? What do you want to get out of this? Then number two, what is the ultimate win for your listener? What do you think that I can give them that they will really dig so that I can focus my message on that point? And then have a point. Find a theme. The theme for this show is asset, how to create and become not a podcast guest, but a podcast asset. So what is the theme of your presentation that you are going to be sharing with them to keep you completely focused on your messaging? Then I'd ask you to do, it's this old trick. It works really well. You've got one theme. Now you probably have at least 3 supporting points that you're going to make to shore up that theme, to support that theme. So be ready to talk about those. Have them in order in how you are going to share them. You share that first point and then give me a story. Here, it's called the business of story for a reason. I want to hear, as my listeners want to hear, true stories about the real world impact you make in people's lives, or it's a true story about you and what you've had to overcome. tell us a short little anecdotal story to support that business point that supports your overall theme. Next thing you know, you're going to have these 3 points. You're going to have these 3 stories. You may even have more. And that's all you need to come across as the expert you are on any show, anywhere, not just the business of story. Don't use opinion. Don't rely solely on assertion. Give us a story, a real world example that makes your point for you. You will be way more interesting and entertaining to our listeners. And it's just much more enjoyable to be entertained and educated all at the same time. And if you follow these basic principles, it will help you. I even, you've all been listening to me for a long time here, not all of you, but those of you have. I use the ABT, the and, but, and therefore. Whenever I'm making any presentation, I want to get my focus. And I wrote one for this. I mentioned it up top, but let me read it to you because I didn't read it all the way. So I first want to find my theme, and this is what I want you to do. So my theme here is, where do I have it? Oh, I've got it written here somewhere, Tom. I'm going back to my notes. How do you turn your podcast guest appearance into an engaging and helpful business asset for the listener, the host, and for you in that order? So asset has become my central word. Now, the whole gist of this show is this, and I'm going to read you my ABT that I wrote down to keep me focused. Business people are clamoring to be on podcasts. We here at Business Story get at least 10 requests a week. And research shows that interviews convert 25 times better than blogs. But guests often blow their appearance because they wing it, frustrating the host and turning off listeners. Therefore, today's show will help you optimize your appearances by providing unbelievable value through the stories you tell and how to tell them well. All I did is wrote that down. It took me 10 minutes to write it down. It gets me focused on my appearance. And here I am appearing on my own show with our guest here. But these are the mechanics, the storytelling mechanics you can use very easily to show up and be that sought after expert and asset that all us hosts are looking for to be in service to our listeners. Tom, do you guys have something similar, or how do you coach your people through this?
Well, the word that you use there is valuable asset. And what is a valuable asset in a podcasting, in content, right? It's something that's cited. It's something that's shared. It's something that's remarked about. And I had to chuckle when you said studies have shown that podcast interviews convert 25 times better than blogs. I'm like, I did that study back in 2015. And I love when that gets cited, because I think what sometimes people forget is they think the conversation is between the guest and the host. They think it Tom and Park are talking right now. That is a small, small segment of the conversation. The asset, the interview, gets valuable when people start talking about it. So that could be the listener talking and thinking, I don't agree with that. I agree with this. I could use this. And so they're having that discussion in their mind. That's when it's valuable. And there's not a lot of other mediums that are like that. How many times have you talked with someone that's a podcast listener and the story starts out with, I was listening to a podcast the other day, Park, and they were talking about this. That is a valuable asset that they're amplifying now. And it wasn't and no one will ever tell you, there was some facts and figures and all of this. They'll remember a story and they'll tell you the story. And this was driven home to me more than anything when I was talking with a friend that was a podcaster. And I said, I just was exposed to this great idea. This gentleman talked about his dad. And when his dad was growing up, the world was small, right? There was limited choices. There was limited customers. And he said, now we live in a different world, right? There's unlimited customers. There's unlimited choices. There's unlimited calories. And the podcaster I was talking to was our mutual friend, Christopher Lockhead. And he stopped me in the middle of the story and he said, was that Mike Maples Jr. that was telling that story? And I'm like, yeah, that's who it was. He goes, that was my podcast. And so I think that shows that you did something on the interview that was remarkable. And the definition of remarkable is that people will remark about it. So they're not going to remember your bio. They're not going to remember facts and figures. If you give them a list of 5 things, maybe they'll remember 2. This is not a board where you can write them all down. But if you give them a story that goes along with that, that's where the value comes from. That's what's going to entertain them. It's what's going to educate them. And it's what's going to serve the listener. It's going to serve the host as people talk about it. And for God's sake, it's going to serve you as the guest if people are talking about you after the podcast.
Well, in our line of work, Tom, we always talk about you as the brand are not the center of the story. You play the more important role as mentor or guide, helping your customers on their journey get what they want through the product or service that you offer. The exact same concept should be in your head when you are being a guest on a show. Now, I've fallen into this trap too, where someone invites you, and it's always, really nice to be on a show, and you do feel a bit special, like, "Ooh, look at me, listen to me. I'm going to share all my great wisdom with you." And then I find that I even have to make that shift and say, "No, wait. This is not about me. This is about them. So what can I talk about that is going to be appropriate to them? Place them, as we do in the story cycle system, at the center of this particular journey, this journey you're having on that podcast. You are simply there in service to them as their mentor or guide, and then entertain them. Tell them great stories to make your business points, but have a point to begin with. What is your theme?"
And that journey and the story, we look at it too as we have clients coming in. It's like, what kind of expert are they? Because we really looked at it and said, there's really 3 types of experts, right? There's the academic, and often those are intimidating to podcasters. I think if we had one, Dr. John Johnson. He's a statistician from MIT. He's the one that gives all of the expert testimony on the big trials like tobacco, all the rest of this. He takes all the big data and makes it understandable. He wrote a book that was intimidating to people. We started to introduce him as John Johnson, who also does this, and just drop the MIT and all the rest of that, because often people can't relate to that. So that's the expert that is more the academic. Next, you've got the old sage, the person that's been doing it for 4 decades. They got some great stories, but as people listen to them, it's not always applicable, right? Yes, this is how you grew your business before the internet. That doesn't help me today. The ones that do the best are the ones that I call the traveler. That person that's one step ahead of me, that knows what I'm going through, that can tell stories that I can relate to. One of the greatest ones I always think of is, example here is Nick Pavlidis, who's got a book and a podcast called Confessions of a Terrible Husband, Lessons Learned from the Lumpy Couch. It's like the 3rd grader.
What a great title.
It's like the 3rd grader teaching 2nd grade math. He gets it, right? And he can help you get to that next step. So with that, I always, tell people that tell stories and make sure that the audience knows that you're like them.
Going back to that walk, social media marketing world, I had given my presentation, 90-minute presentation. It was, we had 600 people in the audience. There were a lot of folks there. And as I was walking out, you came up to me, "Hey, Park, we had talked online, but we had never met in person. And you and I were both staying at the furthest hotel away, I think. So we had a long walk ahead of us. And you said, would you mind if I walked along?" And I got the impression of, oh my goodness, okay, no problem at all. This guy's just going to sell me all the way down to the hotel. And you didn't. You just took the time to get acquainted. You talked about my show. You talked about, had listened to it, obviously, because you mentioned a few aspects of it. And you were just being in service. And you said, I think I got a guy. And that's when it came up. And I was so appreciative of that, because you had done your homework and you've got it, dialed in for us. Now, the next thing that I would like to talk about in that in the sharing of these stories is we'll wrap up with this idea of these conversation crutches. And oh, by the way, I am not editing this show today at all. So you and I have used our fair share of ohs and ums. It just happens. We are all human beings, and it's just going to happen in the show. That's totally fine. Even me fumbling for my notes to try to find that quote, I'm leaving that in because people like that. They like the humanity of a show, that you're showing up as a real person. It's just those long, sustained, punctuated uhs, ahs, ums, likes, rights that will kill your appearance. You won't even show up. You will remain in obscurity on that particular show. Any ideas, any suggestions how people can overcome that?
One of the painful ways to do that is to listen to yourself. And I'm going to listen to this interview afterwards. And when I was in Toastmasters for a short time, one of the things they do is always count who says the most ums, uhs, and they give an award out every time just to make yourself conscious of it. Not self-conscious, but more self-aware. And so often a great way to improve on it is to listen to your last performance. Listen to it and say, is there a better way that I could have told a story? Sometimes it's slowing down, putting that pause in. Was I too fast compared to the host? Comedians are great. After they make a good point, after they make the punchline, they know to pause there. And so I think the same way with any performer, if it's a podcast guest or a podcast host, some people will say, I hate to listen to my voice. Well, get over it. Everybody else in the world, that's how you sound to them. So listen to it and get better. Focus it on a craft. Think of keynote speakers. This is what we're talking about now is a digital stage, right? Think about a physical stage. How many times do you say, what went well? What didn't? What could I improve on? So your first interview you do will probably be the worst interview ever. And that's what we tell our clients. So let's do it internally as a practice podcast interview. It's not recorded, but we'll give you feedback there. A great thing to do with the podcast host also is at the end, just say, is there anything I could have done better? Is there anything that I can improve on? And as you were talking about that walk over to the hotel, it was after your speech, right? How many people after the presentation just walk and go their separate ways? And that goes with guests too, right? Thank you very much for the recording. I'm gone. Well, talk with them a little bit. See what you can do to get better, to build that relationship. It's not just a transaction, a one and done. So I think, I've done over 1,200 podcast interviews. I've still got a lot of improvements to make. And as I look back at early interviews, I cringe, but I'm also take pride that I've gotten a whole lot better.
Well, and the fact of the matter is you show up as yourself. And that's all I want people to do too, is just show up as yourself, but be an articulate self. One of the things that I found when I'm getting interviewed and I'm searching for my words is I'll ask a question. So you'll ask a question of me and I won't quite have the answer teed up in my mind. And I'll say, Tom, that's a really good question. Sometimes I'll even say, let me think about that 1 sec, and just let that time, let them hear you thinking instead of going, because that's what is going to turn them off. So you can use those little techniques like boy, that's a really good question. As I think about that, and then share your answer. It's just, it buys you some time so that you can collect your thoughts versus stumbling around for them.
I love that. And even thanking them for a new question. Often with time we get asked the same questions over and over, and it's very easy just to jump into it. So I love it when I'm asked a new question that I might have to take a second to do it and just say, thank you, Park. I don't know that I have ever been asked that question, but let's work through it together here. And that's just being honest with people. And that's another thing that we tell people often is, to mention the podcast, to mention the host's name. The host is the star here. No one listens to the business of the business of story because they wanted to hear Tom Schwab. No, it's your show. You're the expert, right? So acknowledge who's running the party. Acknowledge that. And that goes along just building up the relationship too, because it becomes more of a conversation than an interview.
Well, Tom, I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. You've got a book out as well, don't you?
I do. It's called Podcast Guest Profits: How to Grow Your Business as a Targeted Interview Strategy. And just before this, it's been out for a few years, but just before this, I was recording the Audible version for it, because one of the things that we tell our clients is if someone's already identified themselves as an Audible listener, give it to the book to them in that form.
Yeah, that's my next step with Brand Bewitchery. I've got to sit down and create that and all the madness out there. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. Again, you felt and heard the frustration in my voice yesterday. And I said, we're going to do this show. Boy, necessity, the mother of invention. And you said, no, actually, I think it's frustration in this case, the mother of invention. And you're exactly right. And I'm also going to be using the show for everybody else that reaches out to the business of story of saying, I want to be on your show. This is going to be a prerequisite. I'm going to ask them to listen to this and then see if they still want to be on the show, and to demonstrate to me how they are going to show up, not only to make my life easier in the edit bay, but to bring that service and that value to our listeners, because they are so hard to attract. And the only way any show is going to retain them is to continue to bring marvelous content from terrific people that can tell stories and educate while they entertain. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And I appreciate all that you do over the last 5 years. And so many of the people in the world want you to be happy. And it's the rare person, Park, that will say, I want you to be better. And so for what you're doing for yourself and your show and your listeners to get better, but also to say, hey, we can do better, to raise the bar in podcasting. And I hope this starts a discussion. I'm going to be sharing it too, to say we can do better. And I hope people will look back and say, remember, halfway through 2020, that was really a turning point when interviews got better, when discussions got better.
Yeah. Well, and a reminder, folks, listeners, that I am just a speck on the wall of the podcasting world. And for me to stay out of obscurity is to bring you unbelievable value that you're happy to share. If you want to be on my show, which I love having folks on my show, of course, I want you to show up prepared and ready to deliver for our listeners. So if you liked what you heard today with Tom and I, feel free to share this episode with anybody you know that wants to be a podcast guest for anybody else, or is in the speaking world, is finding themselves doing a ton of Zoom presentations now, to get them focused on here's what you have to do so that you can show up as the expert you are and really captivate those customers, captivate the listeners on the other end of that microphone. So, Tom, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Park.
And if I can do anything for you out there, my listeners, please join me over at businessofstory.com, where I've got a ton of tools, tips, techniques, and talent like Tom. They're just waiting to help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell. And if you have not yet purchased your copy of Brand Bewitchery, How to Wield the Story Cycle System to Craft Spellbinding Stories for Your Brand, by all means, hit Amazon for me, get your copy, leave a rating and review, and shoot me a note. park@businessofstory.com. Let me know how it's working for you. By the way, I've been getting a lot of notes of people saying, hey, I'm in chapter 3 and I have one question about this, or I'm in chapter 5 and I'm trying to really understand the antagonists in my brand's way. Can you help me understand this a little bit better? I am happy to jump on a call with you to talk through that. So check it out on Amazon. And as you know, we also have a complimentary online course that goes hand in glove with the book. You will find that at businessofstory.thinkific.com. We're having a lot of fun, a lot of folks taking that program, getting through it quickly. It will take you anywhere from 24 hours to 2 weeks is what I'm hearing so far. It just depends on how focused you are on your storytelling and your journey right now. And what better time? I mean, instead of sitting around doing 1,000-piece puzzles, I made that mistake about a month ago of wasting your time during COVID. If your story is a bit of a puzzle right now, then use the book, use the online course to bring your 1,000-piece brand story puzzle together. We can do it in just 10 pieces, by the way. So check it out. And until next week, when we will have another amazing story artist right here for you like Tom, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks so much for listening.